The pioneers of the American frontier faced many daunting challenges and threats in their quest to settle the West. Their story is an extraordinary tale of true grit and the will to survive.
The first frontiersmen were people of just remarkable endurance and courage. The frontier is never an exact line. It's where civilization meets the wilderness. These were people living in isolated cabins at the edge of the frontier with all sorts of threats to them. You had Native Americans, buffalo in the late part of the 18th century. You had panthers there still. Black bear were everywhere. Wolves were everywhere. Black rattlesnakes were everywhere, something called the Indians called masanagwas. There were just a lot of physical threats. The endurance of those people was just breathtaking. And then simply survival in the wilderness. You had to clear, you had to plant, and you had to grow something to eat. Deer was what was the sort of basic meal. Deer and then pigs. Pigs fared very well out there. So between venison and ham, you had pretty much an all carnivore diet.
The challenges of frontier life transformed European pioneers into a new people, Americans, defined by their rugged sense of individualism and self-reliance.
General Gage, who was in charge of the Crown troops in North America, said, as a set of people as wild as the country they live in and far more wicked and vicious. And they were tough people. When you get the early accounts of them, it's absolutely amazing. There's a guy named Jim Bridger, who's probably the most famous of the mountain men. He was 19 years old, living in St. Louis. His mother, father, and brother had died when he was 13, and he was left with his younger sister. He starts a one-man ferry service at age 13 across the Mississippi. And then at 18, he hears about this expedition going west. He signs up, takes off, and he spends the next 2 decades of his life going up and down the mountains. He once said that he hadn't had a piece of fresh baked bread in 17 years because there wasn't a place that could have baked bread that he was in 17 years. And in 1842, Bridger led a party of 100 men on a 1,700-mile walk from the Great Falls of the Missouri to Chihuahua, Mexico, and back, trapping for beaver. I mean, this is down through the spine of the Rockies all the way. 1,700 miles on foot. Absolutely astounding.
American settlers started pushing west soon after the European colonists arrived in the 1600s. But it wasn't until the early 1800s that the vast human migration kicked into high gear.
The fascinating thing about westward expansion is it took almost 200 years to get across the Appalachian and the Blue Ridge Mountains. Once they got across the Appalachian and the Blue Ridge, it took 50 years to get from there 2,000 miles to the Pacific Ocean.
In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French for a mere $15 million, roughly doubling the size of the United States overnight. By any measure, it was one of the largest land transactions in history and fueled the dream of property ownership for anyone daring enough to make the trek west.
America was just a huge real estate event. There's never been a land grab like it. De Tocqueville said something to the effect of, the love of land in America is more active and anxious than he'd ever seen anywhere else in the world. It was this huge, real speculative real estate event, and in order to make the land available, you had to push people out who were there, the Native Americans. All that happened at an accelerating pace after they got over the Blue Ridge Mountains, in part because New England was emptying out. New England, after the Revolutionary War, had very hard economic times. Somebody figured out that it was easier to plant in Ohio than it was to plant in Maine. In 1792, the federal government gave 100,000 acres, something called the donation tract, to the Ohio Company of Associates. And they gave the land in 100-acre parcels to anybody willing to move to the far edge of it because they were the buffer zone against Indian attacks. And then as the 19th century moves along towards mid-century, you had the whole issue of the Oregon Territory. Who was going to get it? The Russians claimed it because it was 100 million acres that went all the way up to the tip of Alaska, and the Russians had a viable claim since they owned Alaska. The British wanted it, pushing west out of Canada, and the Americans wanted it, and so the Americans just did everything they could to push settlers out there. There were always disputes over who owned what land. You know, how are you going to get the Spanish out of California? How are you going to get the Russians to give up their claim in Oregon and Washington State? Where's the northern boundary going to be, 54-40 or fight? This sense that God had ordained that the American people should fulfill their boundaries, basically manifest destiny. You know, that it was America's obligation as the shining city on the hill to claim this land. And you had the gold rushes, the 1849, of course, the 49ers in California. Another one in Montana, heading up into the Yukon. There was profit to be made.
The notorious gold rushes lured hundreds of thousands of speculative pioneers to the American West. But it was a far smaller group of explorers, known as mountain men, who ended up having the biggest impact on westward expansion.
Really, the first settlers after Lewis and Clark discovered a way to get west, were the mountain men, were beaver trappers. And there might have been only about 1,000 of them over the course of 20 years, the 1820s, 1830s, early 1840s. But they did all the infrastructure of westward movement. The mountain men were adventurers who went west in about 1819, 1820 because the economic incentive of beaver pelts was so great. Beaver hats were all the rage in London. So there was a huge economic incentive. The mountain men had found the passes and found the Indian roads and turned them into, eventually, the Oregon Trail, the great superhighway of westward expansion.
The Oregon Trail stretched more than 2,000 miles, from Independence, Missouri, all the way to Oregon and Northern California. At its peak from 1840 to 1860, nearly 500,000 pioneers attempted the grueling 5-month trek.
They couldn't leave before grass was up on the prairie because the livestock had to feed off of it. They had to get to the mountains and over them before the snow came. Donner Party, what you didn't want to have happen to you. So you had a very narrow window, actually, to make that last push of westward expansion. As a result, as more and more people started to go, the trail became incredibly crowded. So if you weren't the first wagon train off in the morning, there might be 60 trains in a wagon, 20, 40, 60. But if you weren't the first one off, you're in dust storms all day long. And then everybody tended to stop at the same place, and you had horrible sanitation. Dysentery became commonplace, typhoid, various other things. Disease killed many, many, many more people by a factor of 10 to 15 than Native Americans killed in the thing. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. Best estimates are that they buried about 25 people a mile, so they about 35 to 50,000 people died along that trail. Give you some sense of the hardship involved.
To reduce strain, many settlers began discarding non-essential supplies, and sections of the Oregon Trail soon became littered with debris.
The trail was not only filled with markers for the people who died, but furniture just got offloaded. You know, you'd start off in Independence with a dresser in the back, and by 500 miles in the trip, you think, what am I doing this for? I have to get over the mountain. So you're always sort of offloading. There are all these things along the side. There were great wagon trains and small ones, and my guess, if I had to say, 100, 120 people at a time, maybe. A day on the road, was up early, was trying to get in line, was a lot of dust, was walking in many cases till sunset. If you had elderly people, they were on the wagon, the possessions were on the wagon, kids were walking alongside, they had livestock with them, which they tried to keep alive, to eat, for milk, for various purposes. It was walking, it was just walking miles and miles and miles, 2,200 miles if you got to the end.
The wagon ruts from the Oregon Trail are still clearly visible in many parts of the western United States, and the impact of the pioneer experience remains etched on the American psyche to this day.
I think we still define ourselves in many ways as a frontier people. That sort of rugged individualism, it's still very much a part of the American character, even if the expression of rugged individualism is no longer what it once was.